Yoon Tae-hyun had spent 55 nights sleeping on the sidewalks of Los Angeles, testing which woman would treat him like a person instead of an inconvenience. Imani Grant was the only one who did. A spare key, a couch, 90 days of a truth she never knew was a lie. At her kitchen table, he finally told her everything. His real name, the 4 companies, the marriage his father was arranging, the $11 million he'd refused to touch for 3 months, just to find out if anyone would help a man who had nothing. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She said she needed time. That same day, Tae-hyun told his father he wasn't marrying Yuri Song, and his mother asked, out loud, what a family like Imani's could possibly bring them. Since then, the family came around completely. At a formal dinner, Sang-hoon tested Imani with one honest question about loyalty, and she answered without flinching, winning him over fully, and opening a real conversation about the company's future, with both included. Then a routine audit surfaced, something unexpected. A founding partnership predating the incorporation, and buyout paperwork that had simply gone missing. Welcome back. If this is your first time here, parts 1 through 5 are everything you need. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Now let's get into part 5. Woo Jin found the name by Thursday, 3 days ahead of the timeline he'd given Tae-hyun, though the specific way he delivered it suggested he wished it had taken longer. Park Yong-tae, he said, setting a folder on Tae-hyun's desk. 73 years old. Lives in Koreatown, 2 miles from where your grandfather's original warehouse used to stand. His grandfather was Park Min-soo, the name on the original filing. What do we know about him? Modest, retired schoolteacher, 30 years in Laosti, no history of litigation, no pattern of shaking down businesses over old claims. This isn't a professional opportunist looking for a payday, Tae-hyun. I ran everything I could find, and it reads like a man who's known about this stake for years and simply never acted on it. Then why now? That's the part that concerns me, Woo Jin said. He didn't file anything. He didn't contact a lawyer. He wrote a letter, handwritten, delivered directly to your father's office 3 weeks ago, before the audit even surfaced the missing paperwork officially. Your father's assistant filed it as a general inquiry, and it sat unopened for 2 weeks. The audit only found the paperwork because someone went looking after the letter mentioned his grandfather's name specifically. Tae-hyun read the letter Woo Jin handed him next, the handwriting careful and deliberate, the specific formality of a man who had drafted and redrafted something he considered important enough to get exactly right. Mr. Jung, my grandfather, Park Min-soo, helped finance the original import license your family's business was built on, in 1974, before either of us were born. He was told, at the time, that his stake would be bought out fairly once the business became established. I have reason to believe that buyout never happened, only that the paperwork was made to disappear instead. I am not writing to threaten your family, or to demand anything beyond the truth. I am 73 years old, and I would like to understand what actually happened to my grandfather's stake before I am no longer here to ask the question. Park Yong-tae. He's not asking for money, Tae-hyun said slowly. He's asking for the truth. Which might be considerably more expensive to give him, Woo Jin said, depending on what the truth actually is. Tae-hyun sat with the letter for a long while after Woo Jin left, reading it twice more. Something about the careful, deliberate handwriting settling into him differently than a legal filing ever could have. He thought about the 11 years he'd spent believing he understood his family's entire history. The warehouse, the first contract, the specific mythology of a man who'd built something from nothing through sheer will alone. He had never once questioned whether that mythology was complete. You're quiet, Imani said that evening, finding him at the kitchen table with the letter still spread in front of him. I keep thinking about how many versions of a family story get told before anyone actually checks whether they're true, Tae-hyun said. My grandfather told my father a specific version of how this company started. My father told me an even more polished version of that. I never once asked whether either version left anything out, because it never occurred to me that a story could be true and incomplete at the same time. Most family stories are, Imani said, sitting across from him, mine included. My mother tells a version of my grandfather's immigration story that leaves out the 2 years he spent undocumented before he found steady work. It's not a lie exactly. It's just the version that's easier to carry forward. This might be considerably harder to carry forward, if it's true, Taehyun said. This isn't just an omitted detail. If Park Yong-tae's grandfather really was pushed out unfairly, my family's entire foundation is built on something we've never had to reckon with. Then you reckon with it, Imani said simply. That's not a tragedy, Taehyun. That's just what growing up actually looks like. For a person or a family, you find out the story was incomplete, and you decide what kind of family you're going to be about it. Sang-hoon read the letter in his study that evening, the same room where he'd once informed his son of an arranged marriage, with the flat certainty of a man who considered the matter settled, and this time his certainty did not arrive so easily. My father never mentioned a partner, he said, more to himself than to Taehyun, who sat across from him waiting for a reaction that hadn't fully formed yet. Not once, in 60 years of stories about the early days. He talked about the warehouse, the first shipping contract, the specific hunger of building something from nothing in a country that gave him no advantages. He never once mentioned a man named Park Min-soo. Is it possible he genuinely doesn't exist in your father's version of events? Taehyun asked. That the paperwork's an error, not a cover-up? It's possible, Sang-hoon said. It's also possible my father built the specific origin story he wanted remembered, and simply left out the parts that didn't fit it. He set the letter down, something heavy settling into his expression. I built this entire company on the belief that I understood exactly where it came from. I'm discovering, at 61, that I may have understood only the version my father wanted me to inherit. Mi-suk, standing in the doorway the way she so often had during the difficult conversations in this family, finally spoke. What does the audit actually show? Documentation of the original partnership filing, dated 1974, Sang-hoon said. No corresponding buyout agreement, no transfer of ownership, no dissolution paperwork of any kind. Legally, if none of that exists, the original partnership may never have been formally terminated. Which means Park Yong-tae may have a legitimate claim to a percentage of this company. Taehyun finished, not because he's inventing one, but because his grandfather's stake was simply erased instead of properly bought out. I don't know that yet, Sang-hoon said. I know only that the paperwork doesn't exist where it should, and that a man is asking a question I don't currently have an honest answer for. Then let's get him an honest answer, Taehyun said. Before this becomes something lawyers manage instead of something our family actually resolves. Sang-hoon looked at his son for a long moment, something in his expression carrying the specific weight of a man recalculating his own history in real time. Your grandfather built the story I inherited, he said. I don't know yet whether I have the right to be angry at a version of him I may have only ever partially known. You don't have to decide how you feel about him tonight, Taehyun said, but we do have to decide what we do about the paperwork. Those are separate problems, even if they feel tangled together right now. Sang-hoon nodded slowly, something practical reasserting itself over the emotional weight of the discovery. I want to see the original filing myself, he said, not a summary, the actual document, in whatever archive it's been sitting in for 50 years. I'll have Woo Jin pull it tomorrow, Taehyun said. There's something else, Mi-suk said, still standing in the doorway. If this is true, if your grandfather really did push a partner out unfairly, I think you need to consider what it means that you're having this conversation with your own son at your side, instead of alone the way your father would have handled it. What does it mean? Sang-hoon asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. It means the family's actually changing, Mi-suk said, not just softening around Imani, actually changing in how it handles difficult truths. Your father would have buried this, the same way he apparently buried it the first time. You're sitting here deciding how to face it honestly instead. That's not nothing, Sang-hoon. I've been married to you for 30 years, and I don't think I've watched you make a decision this quickly, in favor of honesty over protection, in all that time. Sang-hoon was quiet for a long moment. Something moved crossing his usually composed face. I don't know if I'm making this decision because I've genuinely changed, he admitted, or because I watched my son make the same kind of decision, about a considerably more personal matter, and I didn't want to be the only person in this family still choosing the old way. Does it matter which reason it is? Taehyun asked. If the outcome's the same either way? Perhaps not, Sung-hoon said, but I'd like to think, eventually, that it becomes the first reason instead of the second. That the honesty becomes mine, instead of something I'm only borrowing from watching you practice it. Imani came with Taehyun to meet Park Young-tae, a decision Sang-hoon hadn't questioned once she'd offered, the specific quiet trust that had built between them over the past several weeks, making the inclusion feel unremarkable rather than notable. Young-tae's apartment was small, orderly, decorated with the particular accumulated warmth of a man who had spent 30 years making a classroom feel like a second home, and had simply carried the habit into his retirement. He offered them tea before either of them had finished removing their shoes. I did not expect a response this quickly, he said, once they were seated. I assumed, honestly, that the letter would sit unanswered for months, if it was answered at all. My father found it, Taehyun said. Later than it should have taken, but he found it, and he wanted the truth as much as you're asking for it. That's more than I expected, Young-tae said. He retrieved a worn folder from a nearby shelf, the specific, careful handling of documents that had clearly been protected across decades. My grandfather kept a diary, most of his adult life. I found it going through my mother's things after she passed. There's an entry from 1976, 2 years after the original filing, describing a conversation with your great-grandfather in which he was told the business could not survive carrying 2 names on the license and that he would be compensated fairly for stepping back. Was he? Imani asked gently. Young-tae was quiet for a moment, something old and unresolved crossing his face. He received a payment, he said, considerably less than the stake was actually worth, by his own diary's estimation, and considerably less than what the business went on to become worth within a decade. He never contested it. My grandfather was proud and cautious, and he'd already survived enough in this country to understand what happened to immigrants who challenged wealthy men in rooms full of lawyers. He accepted what he was given and never spoke of it publicly again. But he kept the diary, Taehyun said. He kept the diary, Young-tae agreed. I think some part of him always hoped someone, someday, would want to know the actual story, instead of the convenient one. I am not here to punish your family for a decision made 50 years ago by men who are no longer alive to explain themselves. I am here because I am 73, and I would like the actual history acknowledged before I am the only person left who remembers it accurately. Imani reached over and took Taehyun's hand, something steady in the gesture. What would acknowledgement actually look like to you? She asked. Not compensation first. Just, what would it mean to you, if this were resolved the way you actually wanted it resolved? Young-tae considered the question with the specific care of a man who had clearly turned it over many times privately, but rarely been asked it directly. My grandfather's name, he said finally, on something. Anything. He helped build this. I would like that fact to exist somewhere other than a diary only I have ever read. Can I ask you something? Imani said. About your grandfather himself? Not the business. Just him, as a person. Young-tae's expression softened. Of course. What was he like, outside the diary entries about the business? Stubborn. Young-tae said, something fond entering his voice for the first time since they'd sat down. He taught himself English from library books because he refused to pay for classes he considered overpriced for what they actually offered. He grew tomatoes in a lot behind our apartment building that technically belonged to the city, and dared anyone to tell him to stop. He never once, in my entire childhood, admitted to being wrong about anything directly, but he'd change his position quietly, over time, and let you notice on your own that he'd come around. He paused. I think that's part of why he never contested the settlement publicly. He'd already decided, privately, that the money wasn't worth what it would cost him to fight for it loudly. But I don't think he ever stopped believing he'd been wronged. He just decided the fight wasn't the one he wanted to spend his remaining years on. He sounds like he'd have liked my own father, Imani said. Different life, similar stubbornness about what battles are actually worth fighting. Perhaps that's why I felt comfortable writing that letter, Yong Tae said. I've spent 73 years watching my grandfather choose dignity over confrontation, and I've spent the last several of those years wondering whether that choice actually served him, or whether it simply made things easier for the people who wronged him. I decided, finally, that I owed him at least the attempt at the truth, even if nothing came of it. Something's coming of it, Taehyun said. I promise you that. Yong Tae studied him for a long moment. I believe you, he said. Which surprises me somewhat, given how little reason I've historically had to trust a young with anything my grandfather cared about. He offered something close to a smile. I suppose that's what this generation is supposed to be for, correcting what the last one couldn't or wouldn't. A 73-year-old retired teacher just revealed a 50-year-old family secret nobody was ready for. Like and subscribe to help us grow so we can create more content like this, if you're already emotional about what he's actually asking for. This one's about to get complicated, in the best way. Stay close. Sang-hoon listened to his son's account of the meeting in near silence, the specific stillness of a man absorbing something that reshaped his understanding of his own family's foundation. He's not asking for a fight, Sang-hoon said finally. He's asking for a name on something. That's what he told us, Taehyun said. I believe him. I don't think this is a man building toward litigation. I think this is a man who's spent decades carrying a story nobody else in the world knew was true, and he's running out of time to make sure it doesn't disappear with him. What do you propose? Taehyun had thought about the answer the entire drive back from Koreatown, turning over every version he could construct that honored both the legal reality and the human one underneath it. A retroactive settlement, fair by today's valuation, not the number my great-grandfather offered in 1976, he said. And something permanent. His grandfather's name attached formally to the company's founding history, a plaque at the original warehouse site, if it still exists, a line in every future account of how this business began, alongside grandfather's name, not erasing it. That's not a small gesture, Sang-hoon said. Legally or financially. No, Taehyun agreed, but it's considerably smaller than what it would cost us to let this become public in the wrong way. A family that erased a partner's contribution, discovered decades later, handled defensively instead of honestly. I'd rather spend the money and the humility now, while we still get to choose how the story gets told. Sang-hoon was quiet for a long moment, something working behind his composed expression. My father built the story I inherited on omission, he said finally. I have spent this entire year discovering exactly how much damage that particular habit can cause, even when the person practicing it believes he's protecting something worth protecting. He looked at his son directly. Draft the settlement. I want to review it, but I am not going to stand in the way of correcting something my own family should have corrected 50 years ago. I didn't expect you to agree this quickly, Taehyun admitted. Neither did I, Sang-hoon said, something almost rueful in his tone. I think I've spent the last several months relearning how to do that. Agree quickly, when the honest answer is obvious, instead of defending a position simply because defending positions was the only skill my own father ever properly taught me. There's a question I need to ask you honestly, Taehyun said, and I want your real answer, not the one you think a father is supposed to give his son. Ask it. If Imani hadn't taught me to handle Song Chul-min the way I did, and if that hadn't earned your trust in a way nothing else could have, would you have agreed this quickly to correcting something your own father buried? Or would some part of you still be looking for a way to minimize it? Sang-hoon considered the question with visible effort, the specific discomfort of a man being asked to examine his own motives without the usual armor of certainty. I don't know, he admitted finally. I would like to believe I'd have arrived at the same decision regardless, but I think watching you and Imani handle difficult truths honestly, repeatedly, over these past months, made the honest path considerably easier to recognize when it arrived at my own door. I'm not certain I'd have found it as quickly on my own. That's an honest answer, Taehyun said. I'll take it over a comfortable one. I'm learning, Sang-hoon said, that comfortable answers are usually the ones I regret giving. Eventually, I'd rather practice the uncomfortable kind while I still have the chance to get better at them. The settlement meeting took place 2 weeks later, in a conference room considerably less formal than the ones Taehyun had grown up watching his father conduct business inside. Park Yong-tae's choice, at his own quiet insistence, held instead at a community center near his apartment where he'd once taught summer classes. "I want to be direct about something before we begin," Sang-hoon said, once the paperwork was laid out. "My family owes your family an apology, considerably older than either of us. I cannot offer it on behalf of men who are no longer here to offer it themselves. I can only offer it as the person now responsible for what they built and what they left unresolved." "That's more than I expected to hear," Yong-tae said. Something moved crossing his composed features. "Thank you." The settlement itself was straightforward once the emotional weight of the meeting had settled. A retroactive valuation of the original stake, adjusted fairly for decades of growth, along with the acknowledgement Yong-tae had actually asked for. His grandfather's name formally recorded in the company's founding documentation, and a small plaque commissioned for the site of the original warehouse, now a parking structure downtown, marking the partnership that had helped start everything. "I have one more request," Yong-tae said, once the papers were signed. "Not part of the settlement. Simply a request." "Name it," Sang-hoon said. "I would like to meet the woman my grandson mentioned reading about," Yong-tae said, glancing toward Imani with something warm in his expression. "The one who convinced your son that honesty resolves things leverage never could. I think my grandfather would have liked knowing that lesson finally reached the family that owed him one." Imani smiled, something full and unguarded crossing her face. "I'd like that," she said. "Very much." Taehyun watched the exchange with a quiet certainty settling into his chest. Not the specific relief of a crisis resolved, though that was part of it, but something larger, the accumulated weight of an entire year spent learning what his family could actually become when it chose honesty over the easier, older habit of managing everything from a distance. "My grandfather used to tell me," Yong-tae said, as the meeting wound toward its close, "that the truth costs more upfront and considerably less over time than any lie you tell to avoid paying it immediately. I think your family finally understands that lesson, Mr. Jung. I don't think my grandfather could have asked for more than that, in the end." Sang-hoon extended his hand, and Yong-tae took it, the specific gravity of two men, closing a 50-year gap in a single gesture neither of their fathers had managed to close themselves. "I would like to invite you to the plaque dedication, when it's ready," Sang-hoon said. "Not as a formality. As family, if you'll allow the word, however distant the connection actually is." "I'd like that," Yong-tae said. "My grandfather would have found it considerably more satisfying than the settlement itself, I suspect. He always cared more about being remembered accurately than about being compensated fairly." As they left the community center, Imani fell into step beside Sang-hoon, something she hadn't quite planned saying arriving anyway. "You handled that better than I expected," she said. "The apology especially. That wasn't easy to say out loud." "It wasn't," Sang-hoon agreed. "But I found, saying it, that it cost considerably less than I'd spent decades assuming it would. I think that might be the actual lesson buried in all of this, that the things we're most afraid to admit are usually smaller, once spoken, than the weight of carrying them silently for 50 years. That's a lesson worth passing down," Imani said. "I intend to," Sang-hoon said. "Properly this time, with nothing left out." Imani found the small velvet box in Taehyun's coat pocket 3 days later, entirely by accident, reaching for his keys while he showered, and closing her hand instead around something considerably smaller and more deliberately shaped. She did not open it. She set it back exactly where she'd found it, her heart working considerably harder than the discovery should have warranted, and said nothing when he emerged from the bathroom minutes later. "You're quiet," Taehyun said, toweling off his hair, studying her with the specific attention that had never once failed to notice when something had shifted in her. "Just thinking," Imani said, which was true, if considerably more incomplete than she was ready to admit out loud just yet. "About?" he asked, still watching her. "About how much has changed since a sandwich outside a dry cleaner's," she said, which was also true, if still incomplete in the specific direction her thoughts had actually traveled. Taehyun crossed the room and kissed her temple, unhurried, the way he did most things now that urgency had stopped being the primary language either of them spoke in. A lot has changed, he agreed. I think the best parts are still ahead of us. He didn't reach for his coat that evening. The box stayed exactly where it was, waiting for whatever moment he was still deciding was the right one. And Imani, who had learned across the last several months to trust his timing even when she couldn't see the whole shape of it yet, let the question sit unasked, certain now, in a way she hadn't been certain of anything in a long time, that the answer was already decided. She thought, lying awake later that night beside him, about the woman she'd been 90+ days ago, crouching down on a Los Angeles sidewalk with half a sandwich, offering a stranger a spare key because her father had taught her that extra plates were simply what a table was for. She had not known then that the decision would eventually lead here. A family healed, a 50-year-old wrong finally corrected, a box sitting quietly in a coat pocket waiting for its moment. She thought about telling him she'd found it. She decided, instead, to let him have the surprise he was clearly still building toward, however long that building took. Some things, she'd learned across this entire improbable year, were worth letting unfold on their own timeline rather than rushing toward the answer everyone already suspected. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. Not because she needed the certainty of a ring to feel secure in what they'd built, but because she'd already decided, somewhere in the last several months, that this was the family she wanted, regardless of what shape the next chapter actually took. The family secret is finally settled, but something considerably smaller and considerably more personal just showed up in his coat pocket. Comment if you think the timing's finally right, or if there's one more thing standing in the way. Part 6 is coming.